Jeff, Jim, and Carmela, part number 31. Frank was walking the floor, thinking about what they could do. Then he stopped in the middle of the floor and said, "The Orient Express. We will smuggle you onto that train." That famous train was always crowded and would be a perfect place to get lost in the crowd. However, how would they defeat the customs people when they crossed the border? One of Frank's friends had mentioned to Frank several years ago he used one of the train drivers to smuggle something out of the country. It is possible they would take a bribe and let Carmela and Jim ride in the locomotive. Carmela mentioned Margot again, saying she was Bulgarian, not Turkish. She may have some connections she made when she was with Omar. I'm sure she has connections in Bulgaria. If we can get across the border, we will be on our way back to the States. Carmela continued to blame herself for being so stupid by suggesting she and Jim come to Istanbul. The folks that dealt in this spy game had no allegiances and were only interested in accomplishing the mission. The mission accomplished syndrome was what caused Jeff to lose his life. Carmela said they could not stay at her parents' house because they would probably be out front sending in agents any minute. I am sure MI7 will be involved, but will act as if they knew nothing about what was happening. Carmela's dad had a friend who worked for a Turkish shipping company and owned a small house north of Istanbul on the Bosporus. Frank told them his friend said he could use it any time he wanted. Jim started to take control of the situation and use his superior abilities to figure out what to do next. Jim asked Frank how far was the house from their house. Frank said it was about 3.5 miles north of Istanbul. So from the house it was a good 4 miles. Jim told Carmela if she was up to it, they could walk the distance because getting a taxi was not wise. Carmela and Jim borrowed some clothing from Frank and Della, the kind of clothing you would normally see people wearing in Istanbul during the 1960s. Della, when they arrived in Turkey, did not want them to look too Western, so she had purchased some clothing from a Turkish clothing store. Frank, Jim, and Della and Carmela wore about the same size, so they went through the closet selecting something that would blend them into the locals. As usual, it was damp, misty rain when Jim and Carmela began the 4-mile trek to the house of Frank's friend. Few people were walking in this weather, but they were not raising any suspicions as to what they were doing walking in the damp Bosporus weather. Jim knew the intelligence service would not expect them to use such a primitive avenue of escape. A key hidden under a flower pot at the back of the house would give them entry into the house. It was getting late, but the house had a large window, which gave them a good view overlooking the Bosporus. The excitement of being a part of foreign intrigue and a good view of the Bosporus was in ways romantic. Jim and Carmela sat watching the ship traffic and relaxed after the long walk. Jim was thinking about the possibility of skipping out of the country on the Orient Express. This kind of intrigue would always draw a man and a woman close to each other. Jim picked Carmela up in his arms and carried her out of the living area where they sat watching the Bosporus. Jim whispered in Carmela's ear, "Up until now, you said you could not tell any difference between me and Jeff. I know something I bet Jeff never knew, and by in the morning you will lose all comparisons between me and Jeff." The next morning, Carmela could not believe what she had just experienced, and yes, she could no longer compare Jeff with Jim.